Hello and welcome to another episode of The Blue Wave. I'm your host, Max Lopez. We got a really good show for you today. Topics are going to include Republicans passing their debt ceiling bill on a very narrow margin, setting up a debt showdown with Joe Biden, Ted Cruz bombshell leaked audio prior to the January 6th insurrection, as well as Zooey Zepher, Montana lawmaker who is refusing to be silenced in a really awesome way. And on a little bit of a lighter note, we got Joe Biden's secret Oval Office TV, as well as some of his other quirky habits that he has. So starting off here, we're going to go into the Republicans passing their debt ceiling bill by a very slim margin. Okay, so we got an article here. House GOP passes debt limit bill, paving the way for a clash with Biden. House Republicans narrowly passed a bill to raise the debt ceiling while cutting spending by nearly 14% over a decade. Biden has vowed to veto the measure. Says the House on Wednesday narrowly passed Republicans' bill to raise the debt ceiling while cutting spending and unraveling major elements of President Biden's domestic agenda in a GOP bid to force Mr. Biden to negotiate over spending reductions or risk a catastrophic debt default. Facing his most significant challenge since being elected to his post, Speaker Kevin McCarthy barely cobbled together the votes to pass the bill, which was approved 217 to 215 along party lines. The legislation would raise the debt ceiling into next year in exchange for freezing spending at last year's levels for a decade, a nearly 14% cut, as well as rolling back parts of Mr. Biden's landmark health, climate, and tax law, imposing work requirements on social programs, and expanding mining and fossil fuel production. Okay, so all these things that were just mentioned, as well rolling back Biden's landmark health, climate, and tax law, imposing work requirements on social programs, and expanding mining and fossil fuel production. These are some of the elements of the bill which contribute to Chuck Schumer and Biden and others, alluding to the fact that the bill is dead on arrival in the Democratic-controlled Senate. Dead on arrival, meaning it's most certainly not going to pass. So you really have to look at what is the calculus here for the Republicans to pass this bill through that they know is going to be dead on arrival in the Senate. And from their perspective, it's to be able to pitch to the American people, hey, look, we've passed something. We don't want the catastrophic consequences of a debt default to happen. So we've passed something, and it's the Democrats, it's Biden that want it to default. See, they're vetoing it. Look, they don't want to raise the debt ceiling. It's their problem, right? But what you're going to have Democrats arguing is that we are not going to negotiate with a gun to our head and have us be told negotiate and pass our spending cuts, or we pull the trigger on the American economy. That's not a negotiation. The Democratic Party is simply not going to be held hostage and have major elements of Biden's administration successes, right? Major progresses that we've made. Clean energy tax credits, the child tax credit program. The Democrats are simply not going to allow for such a bill to pass. And this sets up a situation where we have a game of chicken, a really dangerous game of chicken being played. And who is going to blink first, right? The MAGA GOP have shown themselves to be very stubborn, and they've shown themselves to be very anti-American. And my fear is that we are at risk. The risk of a debt default happening in the United States is higher than it's ever been. just due to the amount of concessions that Kevin McCarthy gave to this far-right MAGA wing of the GOP House in order to become Speaker in the first place, right? So let's say that they're not able to pass it through the Senate and it gets vetoed back. There's nothing stopping the Republicans from coming up with a even more drastic bill to cut even more spending and to send that to the Senate and to have that get vetoed. It's a very dangerous game that we're heading towards, of politics being played with people's paychecks and with people's government assistance. And I really don't put it past the MAGA GOP wing to send us into such a crisis. And it's going to be interesting to see what continues to happen over the summer and whether or not the Democrats are going to have to end up budging on certain aspects of the bill and passing it to avoid a catastrophic debt default. Now, I really don't think that Biden is going to cave at all, because they don't have any reason to, because the Republicans are going to run home and blame everything on the Democrats anyways, right? They're already blaming Biden for the inflation. They're already blaming for everything under the sun that's going wrong in America. They're blaming Biden for it already. So I really hope that the Democrats are able to hold strong and that they are able to not blink even for a second and give in at all to the far right MAGA demands, okay? And we're going to see what happens over the summer. Well, like I said earlier, I really believe that we are at risk of a debt default happening, and it's something that people need to begin to prepare for. And there's not really any way I see out of this where the Democrats are going to suddenly be willing to roll back, 14% spending over the next 10 years. It's just not going to happen. You don't have anyone in the Democratic Party outside of maybe Joe Manchin who's even going to consider that for even a second. And given the makeup of the Senate, the Republicans don't have the votes to get it through. And even if it did pass the Senate, Biden's already said he's most certainly gonna veto it. So I'm not sure where that leaves us. It's quite scary, and I'm holding out for news that this is gonna get better, just like everyone else. All right, moving on here. We got bombshell audio from Ted Cruz plotting to overthrow the election. We've heard a lot of discourse from the far right about how January 6th was simply a mob that lost control and Trump didn't want them to do what they did. And there's a bunch of bad apples that spoiled the bunch, and it was mostly a peaceful protest. And mostly everybody there was peacefully demonstrating, and that the purpose was for the American people to be able to voice their honest concerns that they had about the election. We've all known that this is bullcrap, and that in fact it was a coup plot that was being discussed by various members of the government. Okay, from November 20th, 2020 up until January 5th, 2021, the plotting and scheming and planning was happening. This is just a bit more direct evidence of it. So let's go ahead and play this audio clip here, and we'll listen to a little bit of analysis as well here on MSNBC.
We're looking at this January 6th certification. All of the options that were being discussed were problematic. The mechanism to try to force that is denying certification on the 6th.
Who's deciding who gets inaugurated?
It would be the results of that commission.
I'm joined by Michael Steele. Your reaction?
Wow. So before we listen to this analysis here from Michael Steele, I just want to note the tone of her voice. It's almost, she has this inquisitive, sort of a bit confused tone to her voice of, well, who's gonna decide who's inaugurated? Who's gonna decide that? It's almost as if the light bulb is going off in this person's head, and I'm not sure who this lawmaker is. But you can almost hear the light bulb going off inside of her head that, oh my God, we're trying to steal the election, aren't we? That's what we're doing here. We're stealing it.
Masterclass. Look, this absent paper trail and kernels here and there is confusing. It is difficult because there's so many pieces that we don't have, right? You filled in a lot of that information, and the fact that you got the reaction from the senator's office and the senator himself tells me that you struck a nerve. And the reality right now, and this goes to what you said in the beginning of this of your conversation with the audience, is Jack Smith and the entire January 6th team now are looking at this. And this is another piece that's going to fit in very nicely. It's not just what, the players that we once knew about. Now you've added a senator who says, hey, yeah, I had this conversation. And then you got the quiet part, right, with Borromo, when she's asking, well, then how does this work? Well, the commission, clearly, we'll stop it there. This is the whole point, is why we're doing what we're doing.
Do you almost get the impression that although the reason he was talking to her is that she was supportive, you almost get the impression that behind the scenes, people were starting to really absorb, oh, y'all just going to steal this. That's the plan.
Well, yeah. And look, there was, you can almost sense, if you go back at that time, and particularly if you take everything that we now know and go back, you can almost feel the urgency and the sort of rush to try to get this thing done quickly. And so there was a lot of urgency around the idea of, because they're on a constitutional clock. You can't lose sight of it. This is what tripped up the Democrats in Bush v. Gore, was that constitutional clock, right? You had the same requirements here. On January 6th, this is going to happen. So if you don't have a plan in place by January 5th, January 6th doesn't happen the way you hope it would happen. And so a lot of these early conversations between the 21st of November and the 5th of January is what you're now putting out here. And these are just additional pieces that are filling in some of those background noises that we now realize, that wasn't noise, that was actual planning, that was actual conversations, sort of thinking through, how do we do this?
So to me, it begs the question of, what else is out there in terms of direct evidence of plotting. We've heard the January 6th committee's evidence and how well that was laid out, and how we heard lots of communications from Cassidy Hutchinson and Mark Meadows, other Trump aides, their really disbelief as to what they were planning to do. But this is really interesting because Ted Cruz, being one of the top Republicans really in the country, one of the most notorious Republicans anyways, it really just begs the question of what else is out there in terms of communications that has been intercepted, who has this information, and when are we really going to know the full picture of what transpired from not only on January 6th, but from November, like Michael Steele here said, from November 21st to January 5th. We know that there was plotting. We know that there was planning. We know that the mob that was being directed to be at the Capitol on the 6th, we know what their purpose was now. I just really would like to know personally, what else do we have on these guys? And how many years is it going to be until we really know everything that happened and just how bad it got and how far away from American democracy the GOP was operating, not only today but during that time period? And just the sheer scale of the debauchery and the utter contempt for the American people's vote, and the utter contempt for every single person who voted for Joe Biden. It makes my stomach, makes this pit in my stomach feeling, just knowing how far and how far they were willing to go to subvert the 2020 election. Really, really not a good look here for Cancun Ted Cruz. But given his constituents in Texas who reelected him after, a not so great 2020, and after he flew to Cancun during the deep freeze in Texas, they reelected him. So I don't really think that this is going to move the needle at all in terms of MAGA people. They're not paying attention to this stuff anyways, and they didn't pay attention to the January 6th committee that was held last summer. So another really, really interesting, damning piece of evidence against one of the top Republicans planning to overthrow a Democratic election. Is it going to move the needle at all in terms of perception of the GOP? Unfortunately, I don't think so. So moving on here, we got Zooey Zepher, Montana transgender lawmaker who has been disciplined by the GOP of the state for making the statement of that the GOP having blood on their hands based on banning transgender affirming care. Some really interesting transgressions here about how she's fighting on during first day of exile, Los Angeles Times. Montana transgender lawmaker Zooey Zepher spent her first day in legislative exile Thursday, relegated to a bench in a noisy hallway across from a snack bar outside the House chambers, where she is no longer allowed. Zepher defiantly stayed put even after the Republican House Speaker said she couldn't be there, and a House security officer threatened to move the bench where she had set up her laptop. She listened to debate and voted remotely from there with a pink sticky note on the wall above her head with seat 31 written on it, her seat assignment in the House. You can see it right there. How cheeky. So she gets a little sticky note and she puts it above. She says, "You're not going to let me partake inside of the chamber? Well, I'll sit outside of it on a bench, and I'll put a little sticky note, and this is now my seat." I mean, how cheeky, how courageous, in the face of so much hate, so much vitriol, so much just, harassment that I'm sure this woman is facing. And for her to not only say, "I'm going to continue to participate, doing my work. I'm going to show up at the building and get as close as I can without actually being in the chamber. And I'm going to exercise what I was elected to do." Really courageous. Really courageous. And I think that this Zooey Zepher figure, we're not hearing the end of her story. Republicans have wanted Zepher to participate from behind the doors of the House minorities' offices a day after they voted to ban her from the House floor for the rest of the session, which ends early next week. Her refusal to do so came as Democrats sought to keep Zepher's banishment in plain view after a week's worth of nationwide public scrutiny over Republicans' unprecedented actions to silence her. I walked out yesterday with my head held high, and I walked in with my head held high today, ready to do my job, Zephyr told the AP. Yeah! As cameras snap and espresso beans churned in a machine nearby, Zephyr and Democratic leaders promised she would remain in the public eye unless Republicans elected to further limit where she could go in the Capitol. There are so many more eyes on Montana now, Zephyr said, but you do the same thing you've always done. You stand up in defense of your community, and you stand up for the principles that they elected you to stand for. The motion Republicans passed bars Zephyr from the marble-pillared house, the gallery above it, and the waiting room, but not in the public space in the hall where she set up. So, the detention is a new phenomenon for Zephyr, a 34-year-old serving her first term representing a western Montana college town after being elected in November. In her interview with the AP, Zephyr linking the efforts to silence her to the decision by the Tennessee lawmakers to expel 2 black representatives for disrupting proceedings when they participated in a gun control protest after a school shooting in Nashville. So I really think that this GOP push to use all they can in terms of the rules of proceedings and basically ousting opposing views, whether it be in the case of the Tennessee lawmakers wanting for stricter gun control measures, the banning of assault rifles. This Zooey Zephyr here is ousted for her views on transgender care. And really what these Republicans are doing is they're going ahead and they're creating martyrs out of these individuals. I would have never known who this person is. I would have never would have heard about Zooey Zephyr if it wasn't for the GOP's push to silence her, right? And so I really don't think that this is working out in the way that the Republicans would have hoped it is, in that, you know, sort of making an example out of these lawmakers in hoping that in the future people who might want to speak out in a similar way are going to see how how Zooey Zephyr was treated, how the Tennessee lawmakers were treated, and go, you know what? I like my seat. I like being in power so much that I'm going to just go ahead and not stand up for what I truly believe in. And I'm going to go ahead and let the Republicans repress and suppress my voice and my vote in hopes of saving face and not having to, you know, answer hard questions. And, you know, there's nobody that's going to be willing to do that. There's nobody that's going to be willing to fold over to these strict Republican rules that are being enforced. And I really believe that the more that the GOP continues to severely punish lawmakers for having opposing views, if they continue to punish them in the places where they have the votes to punish them, there's going to be martyrs are going to be continued to be made, and the GOP's election chances in 2024 are going to continue to be hurt by stories like this becoming national news. And lastly, on a little bit of a lighter note, we have Joe Biden's secret Oval Office TV. So got an article here from Politico and other media habits of the 46th president. So when we think of Trump, we immediately think of him being in his Oval Office, watching TV all day long, having fast food delivered to him, and he has a button for a Coke to be delivered to him. Coca-Cola button that he would hit, and someone would come in and bring him a Diet Coke. We know that Trump is very enthralled in how the media depicts him, in what his public image is, what the American people are saying about him. very, very image self-conscious. We haven't heard much in terms of Joe Biden's habits, really, in his administration so far, whether he watches TV, whether he doesn't. So this is a really interesting article here to me, just based on the fact that we've heard so little about Joe Biden's day in and day out habits in the White House. So we may not ever have a president like Donald Trump, a reality TV star who spends hours in the Oval Office watching TV and reacting in real time to coverage of himself. But while he can't match his predecessor's compulsive appetites, that doesn't mean Joe Biden isn't obsessed with the media in his own way. He's not just an avid media consumer. Yes, there's a TV hidden in the Oval Office. He's also very attuned to how the media portrays him and is likely to get miffed over critical coverage of the media's myopic focus on breaking news over the big picture. He'll call up his favorite writers and columnists, and he pays close attention to the number of people defending him on TV. On this weekend that celebrates the long history of chronicling the most important office in America, we thought we'd find out how the current occupant of the White House consumes the work of those who regard him so relentlessly. Here are 7 things to know about the president's media diet. First off, his morning routine, exercise with a side of Morning Joe. Aides say the president isn't a religious viewer of any particular cable news show, but if there's one he watches with regularity, it's Morning Joe. Unlike Trump, who started tweeting before most of Washington awoke, Biden typically isn't watching the first 6 a.m. hour or rage tweeting about Mika, but he will often tune in while riding his exercise bike around 7 a.m. And we're told he's occasionally in touch with some of the hosts and has at times conveyed positive feedback about what they've said. For instance, he let Joe Scarborough know that he enjoyed his description of Senator Ron Johnson, Republican of Wisconsin, as having rocks in his head. There's a tiny TV in the Oval Office. While people step into the Oval Office, they might notice the 5 presidential portraits hung over the fireplace, or the grandeur of the historic Resolute desk, but not the little television. That's the point. The TV monitor sits behind Biden on another desk topped with picture frames, encased in a golden frame itself as to be inconspicuous. But when there aren't press cameras or dignitaries in there, the 10 or 12-inch screen is often turned on and tuned to CNN. While Biden isn't spending hours in his private room glued to a big screen as his predecessor was, several current and former White House officials told me that the president will keep an eye on his secret screen behind his desk and reacts to coverage during less formal meetings with staff. Television outside the Oval and aboard Air Force One are also almost always on CNN during the day, not the Quad, the 4-box available in the building to staffers who want to keep an eye on all of the main cable networks simultaneously. He calls people he sees on TV. Interesting. The way to integrate yourself with Trump was simple. Just say nice things about him on TV. Biden is not as insecure and easily won over as his predecessor, but he has been known at times to pick up the phone to personally thank people articulating helpful messages on television, be they hosts, Al Sharpton has gotten such calls, or panelists. Last summer, as Democrats' big spending package was languishing in Congress, Biden called Jim Messina after seeing him on MSNBC defending the administration's agenda. According to people familiar with these calls, Biden will often solicit feedback or advice from the journalists and politicos he dials up. Interesting. So Biden not only pays attention to the media in a somewhat close manner, but he's willing to reach out to people who he sees as having his back and going to bat for him on TV, which is people that are far and few between, let's be honest here. And this is an interesting little tidbit here that he will solicit feedback or advice from the journalists that he dials up. So this shows that Biden is willing to listen and he's willing to try to be better on things that he can be in order to be portrayed in a more friendly way. That to me is showing somebody that's, wanting to learn and was wanting to be the best that they can in order to appeal in a certain way, right? He's not just calling up people and going, "Oh, you said something bad about me. You're a bad guy now," or you said something good about me and now you're my best friend. No, what Biden's doing here is he's soliciting feedback and advice from the journalists on how he could do certain things better, which I think is really interesting for the most powerful man in the whole world to be asking for advice from people who don't have such power. It just shows, I think, the kind of man that Biden is. And he has his favorites. It's safe to say that Biden isn't up late in the Lincoln bedroom chatting with Sean Hannity after his show. The president's close relationships with members of the media are with his contemporaries, the reporters and commentators he's been reading and interacting with since his years in the Senate. The group includes Times columnist David Brooks and Thomas L. Friedman, both of whom have had audiences with Biden at times, and Mike Barnacle, the Morning Joe regular and longtime columnist. He's also maintained a relationship with the New Yorker's Evan Osnos, who has turned a lengthy interview with Biden during his campaign's early quarantine basement days into a book. He has occasionally talked foreign policy with Friedman, who got to know Biden when he was a senator on a 10-day trip to the Middle East. Earlier this year, Friedman even succeeded in getting Biden to issue him a short statement on a Saturday about pro-democracy demonstrations in Israel, which he used in a column. This is the first time I can recall a U.S. president has ever weighed in on an internal Israeli debate about the very character of the country's democracy, he wrote. Interesting. Biden is willing to go above and beyond to people who he feels like have his back and people who he feels treat him fairly. He's a print guy. Biden has the same push alerts on his cell phone we all do, but he is a traditionalist when it comes to newspapers. When he took office in 2021, he asked aides to make sure the print editions of the New York Times, Washington Post, and then the Wall Street Journal were available to him in the White House residence and the West Wing, according to several administration officials. The papers are delivered very early in the morning to the executive residence staff and the West Wing, the officials said. No one has yet seen him autographing news clippings with a Sharpie and sending them to pals. So, last couple things here. He reads his own clips like everyone in Washington. Every White House compiles daily clips for the president and top aides, but we're told Biden is particularly interested in the local news people across the country are reading. When he flies home after an event, staffers aboard Air Force One print out stories by local outlets that covered his appearances for him to read on the plane. And every day inside the West Wing, the staff secretary office puts together a binder of national and local news clips and front pages, including from Black, Latino, and AAPI-focused outlets. Aides who have spent time around the president also said that he'll often note an article referenced during a cable news segment and ask a staffer to print it out for him. When he was vice president, his clips also included news stories from Delaware, and we're told he still keeps tabs on local happenings. But he doesn't love the coverage. In occasional comments to reporters, Biden has betrayed a frustration with the media's coverage of him writ large, complaining that you guys probably won't cover what cause or topic he's eager to talk about at the moment. In several instances, he has refused to respond to shouted questions on topics unrelated to the event at which he's speaking. Aides, concerned in part about the president's ability to hear shouted questions beneath the whir of Marine One's rotor blades, have tried to limit situations where the president is confronted and perhaps enticed to engage by a horde of shouting reporters. Unlike many of his predecessors, Biden has cultivated few relationships with reporters through off-the-record meetings and conversations. And the one time he has visited the press cabin aboard Air Force One, something Trump did regularly, his off-the-record comments included complaints about his coverage. He has rarely griped publicly about any specific report, but some have gotten under his skin, including a story last summer by the New York Times' Peter Baker about his age becoming an uncomfortable issue. Multiple people around the president confirmed. Understandable. While the president has affirmed the importance of the press independence and its role in a democracy, you'll hear no enemies of the people rants from him. He often grumbles privately that news coverage is too focused on his predecessor and other fleeting controversies, and believes that the media has failed to focus on the historic nature and real-world impact of his legislative accomplishments. He often complains to staffers, especially those who oversee communications, not enough people defend him on cable television, something those plotting his re-election campaign are hoping to remedy with a more robust surrogate operation. It's true. If you watch any mainstream media, there isn't a far left media agenda that's pushing Biden's agenda, as the right loves to claim that there is. It just doesn't freaking exist. There's Fox News, which is an apparatus of the far right, but even the most liberal news station, MSNBC, is often engaged in this sort of both parties mantra, or they're engaged in this sort of idea that we need to give fair and balanced coverage to both sides, no matter how crazy, no matter how outlandish. We need to give them coverage because that's the side that people care about. And MSNBC is the best in terms of fair coverage of Biden. I'm going to sneeze here. Yeah, it's coming. Oh, excuse me. But CNN, for example, they're totally, there's no liberal agenda happening on CNN at any point in time. Does anybody push a liberal agenda on people at CNN? They're centrist at best, and at worst, they're basically they pander to people on the right. They're trying to pander to people who aren't listening to Fox News anymore, for one reason or another. And CNN seems to think that there's some sort of move they can make to appeal to disenfranchised people from the GOP. I would love if there was a leftist media pushing out a leftist agenda to the American people. It just doesn't happen, and I think Joe Biden is right here to point out that, you know, the media coverage of his campaign has been very, very shoddy at best. It is not focused on nearly any of the lasting accomplishments of his administration. It's not focused on the real world impact that Biden being president, the benefits of Biden's presidency that people are experiencing. For example, a child tax credit. You know, you don't hear about how that's making a difference in the poorest people of America's lives, and how it's allowed people to raise families again in some instances. You just don't hear about it. You know, the media is always going to be focused on the shiny object of the week, and next week there's another shiny object. And the way the government works and the way that presidential administrations influence America is often kind of can be a long-term thing, and it's not just now dopamine. Now we did this, here's the effect, there's your dopamine. It's not always like that. Things can take years and years to manifest, such as the Affordable Care Act's, you know, great benefit that it is having for people now. It took years for it to get running. It didn't start off great. It didn't start off amazing. It started off kind of bad. It started off with a lot of people criticizing it, and the website didn't work. But over time, we've seen how beneficial it's been for the American people. And I really just hope that the media can pay a bit more attention to some of the lasting impact of the Biden administration's legislation that they've passed through. So that's all I got for you guys in this show. I really want to thank you so much for listening with me today. And I hope that you have a fantastic rest of your day. Be sure to like, subscribe for more content, and we'll catch you back in the next video. All right. So thanks again. Have a good one. Bye.